Hello, welcome to Author Spotlight. My name is Lucy, and this is the program on AADL TV where I take some time each episode to highlight the works of one single author. The author that I'm going to be talking about today is Akwaeke Emezi. They are a Nigerian-born best-selling author. They have published 4 books so far since the year 2018. They have 3 more coming out in the year 2022, so they are very prolific. Emezi is an artist and writer based in liminal spaces. Their art practice is located in the metaphysics of Black spirit and uses video, performance, writing, and sculpture to create rituals processing their embodiment as a non-human entity, an ogbanje, a deity's child. Each of their 4 books has been awarded, honored, nominated, or longlisted in its genre. The first book that I'm going to tell you about today is a novel called Freshwater, which was published in 2018, and this was Emezi's first book. It is the story of Ada, who is a girl born in Nigeria with gods inside of her. She is ogbanje. Ogbanje is a child that grew up with this one foot on the other side. In Emezi's memoir, Dear Sentharun, they identify ogbanje as an Igbo spirit that is born to a human mother, a kind of trickster that dies unexpectedly, only to return in the next child and do it all over again. So Ada, the main character of Freshwater, is born with these gods and spirits inside of her. The book is narrated from multiple points of view, which is something that runs through most of the books that Emezi has written. Sometimes the narrator is a group of voices called we, that is all the spirits that are inside Ada. Sometimes the book is from Ada's point of view. Much of the time we are getting narration from one of the spirits who it really embodies Ada more than the other spirits, or the central spirit that lives inside of Ada. So Ada is born in Nigeria and then moves to America for college. And when they are in college, Ada experiences a trauma, and this wakes up the gods that are inside of her. And she starts to splinter into separate selves. Ada splinters into these different selves, and they both hurt and help her. They encourage self-destructive behavior, and they start to become the bigger part of Ada. She has to both battle and ultimately learn to live with them. In Western culture, Ada would be given a diagnosis of having multiple selves, or definitely a diagnosis of having a mental illness. And Ada is very aware of that if she goes to health professionals, this is something that they will diagnose her with, instead of recognizing the indigenous realities of other cultures, which is that Ada is more than one spirit. She is ogbanje. The multiple spirits, the narrator called we, even make mention of the fact that Ada would be looked at as mentally ill. They say, earlier when we said she went mad, we lied. She has always been sane. It's just that she was contaminated with us, a godly parasite with many heads roaring inside the marble room of her mind. And this book is very much about warring with your personality. It also is about gender, and it's about transitioning, and it is about rage and controlling your rage. And there is mental illness in this book. Being embodied with spirits makes Ada think she's mentally ill, and at times it does really change the way her mind works. But really, this is a book about embodiment. Ada is embodied with spirits. She is ogbanje, and Emezi has said that when readers' analysis centers on mental illness, that is a very Western point of view. We are refusing to see the Igbo ontology that exists in this book. This is a very autobiographical piece of fiction, and if you read Emezi's memoir, Dear Sentharun, that will really be highlighted to you. The multiple personalities in this book represent a chorus throughout, and it's how we learn about Ada's life. The writing in this book is phenomenal. It just cracks you open, for lack of a better way of explaining it. There's something universal about a lot of the descriptions in this book, and it invites you to think about the way that we view the world and the way that we could learn to view the world differently. Freshwater is just a stunning, haunting book, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. The second novel for adults that Emezi published is called The Death of Vivek Oji. And this is a story of reincarnation. I watched an interview with Emezi where they said that this was their exploration of real fiction. Freshwater had been extremely autobiographical, and they wanted to write a story that was purely fictional. You know from the very beginning that Vivek dies. The first chapter of this book is one sentence long. Chapter 1 in its entirety is, they burned down the market the day Vivek Oji died. So then we learn the story of Vivek's life and his birth and how he was the true reincarnation of his grandmother. His grandmother died at the exact time and day that Vivek was born, and they shared the exact scar on their foot. And in Igbo culture, the tradition would be to name the child that was born on the death of a relative. They would name the child after that relative. Vivek's parents do not give him that traditional name because they assume his gender, and so they don't feel that the name aligns with Vivek's gender. So the rest of the book is basically an exploration of what the spiritual repercussions are for Vivek of not being given the right name. And so the book is narrated from multiple points of view. We get some chapters from Vivek. We get a lot of chapters from Osita, who is Vivek's cousin and very close to Vivek. And we get some chapters from Vivek's mother, Kavita. Vivek has, throughout his teenage years into his early adulthood, these blackouts that he calls fugues. And they're sort of this flashback to a life that is not his own. He says, life was like being dragged through concrete in circles, wet and setting concrete that dried with each rotation of my unwilling body. As a child, I was light. It didn't matter too much. I slid through it, and maybe it even felt like a game, like I was just playing in mud, like nothing about that slipperiness would ever change. Not really. But then I got bigger, and it started drying on me, and eventually I turned into an uneven block, chipping and sparking on the hard ground, tearing off into painful chunks. Heaviness found me, and I couldn't do anything about it. So that sort of gives you an indication of the spiritual weight that Vivek feels, having been born in a body that doesn't feel like his own and given the wrong name, and being given a gender that he does not feel is the right gender for him. Osita, his cousin, probably knows Vivek better than anyone and loves Vivek deeply. Vivek also has a group of friends who know more about how he died. We know from the beginning that he died. He's left at his mother's doorstep in a green dress, and that's all she knows. She doesn't know any more about how he was killed. And his friends know, but they don't want to share the side of the life that led to this with Vivek's mother. They think that it will break her heart more than it is already broken. The chapters that Vivek's mother, Kavita, narrates really show you how much her heart is broken, not only because her son died, but because she didn't know him and she didn't know who he was. And a lot of the plot of the book is structured around her search for this, her search to find out how he died, and her search to find out who he really was before he died. And those chapters narrated by her alternate, as I said, with chapters of Osita's life. And then you get words from Vivek himself. And this book about reincarnation also talks deeply about grief and how grief can just split people open. Vivek's mother, Kavita, says, it was only once he'd become a man that she realized she couldn't reach him anymore, that he was gone, so gone, that breath had left his body. No one else could feel that lifetime of loss. No one else had lost him more than she had. And the mother's love in this book is a very strong part of it, but it's also an interesting twist. that it was Vivek's parents in the first place who misunderstood who Vivek was. The writing in The Death of Vivek Oji is equally as stunning as the writing in Freshwater. It pulls you in, and the writing's very emotional, and so it's hard to tear yourself away. In between these novels for adults, Emezi wrote a young adult novel called Pet. This is the one book of fiction that they wrote that is a straight narration. It's just one narrator. And Pet is about a girl named Jam. She is a trans girl. The book takes place in the town of Lucille, which is a post-revolution utopian society where evil has essentially been eradicated. That's the way the adults explain it to the children, that a band of angels took it upon themselves to rid the culture of all the monsters. This book is very much about monsters versus angels and this sort of blurred line between them. Who in our society and our world around us are the real monsters and who are the angels? This coincides with the themes of Emezi's other works. I especially see connections to Freshwater, this sort of idea of gods and monsters and who is good and who is evil being very nebulous. In Pet, Jam and her friend Redemption often look at books that they take out from the library of angels, and they see that the angels look scary in books and the monsters just look like regular people. So this is confusing to them, and the fact that no adults will talk about monsters at all is also frustrating, but also dangerous for kids growing up in Lucille, because if they don't know anything about who a monster is, how will they identify a monster when they meet one? Jam's best friend is this boy named Redemption, and that's one thing I love about this book is they have a very close friendship. They're teenagers, but it is a completely platonic friendship. As I said before, Jam is a trans girl. That's not central to the story. It's just a fact of the story. She has a mother from Trinidad and a father from Nigeria, and her parents, along with the other adults in Lucille, refuse to even acknowledge the existence of monsters. And it's sort of this mass gaslighting on the part of the adults in this town to tell children that there are no monsters. And what's interesting about the monsters in this book, they were not monsters as we traditionally would think of. They're monsters as people who exist side by side with us in society and people who have just wrought evil in their everyday existence. The book is called Pet because there's a monster that comes alive in the book when Jam is looking at her mother's drawing of this monster. And Pet seems scary in the way that Pet looks very much like a traditional monster, but Pet is in fact there to root out a monster who still exists in Lucille. So it's surprising to learn who the monster is, and it's interesting to think about the idea of angels as in fact being a sort of vigilante mob who had to go out and do terrible things to eradicate terrible monsters. One of the books that Emezi is publishing in 2022 is called Bitter, and this is a sequel of sorts to Pet. Bitter is Jam's mother. I'm hoping that book will give us some of the backstory of Lucille before the monsters were eradicated. The last book that I want to tell you about today is Akwaeke Emezi's memoir, which came out in 2021, and this is called Dear Sentharun. And it is written in the form of letters to many different people, some friends, some lovers, some authors, some public figures. It was interesting to read Dear Sentharun after having read Freshwater, and it sort of changed for me how I had thought about Freshwater. I went back and read Freshwater again after reading the memoir, and I realized how much Freshwater is actually about embodiment and not about the multiple voices of mental illness. So in their memoir, Emezi exposes their vulnerability in an extremely transparent way. They show you the immense strength that they have had to draw on, take care of, and nurture in order to become and sustain their belief in who they are, despite what the rest of the world tells them. Emezi writes very openly about surgeries that they had to transition, and they write very openly about being ogbanje, and again, in a way to shift the center for us to realize that much of our literature does not take a view outside of what the Western cultural norms are. Emezi said in an interview that I read, "I kept looking for stories like the one I was telling, but I couldn't find them, and that terrified me." And they said that before they published Freshwater, and how fearful they were about putting that story out into the world. The vulnerability that it took to do that is highlighted in Dear Sentharun, and it makes some of the letters heart-wrenching, yet those are the very same letters that display Emezi's strength and mental fortitude. And you see in the letters that they write in Dear Sentharun that they have learned to embrace their power, and they refuse to bend down, they refuse to conform to what society expects them to be. Reading Dear Sentharun really helps to inform all of their works that came before. You see some of the same themes and this sort of idea of monstrosity existing within the structures of power, something that was highlighted very much in Pet. Obviously, it's closely connected to Freshwater because Ada's story is very close to Akwaeke Emezi's story. All of Emezi's writing is rebuking again and again this Western construct and insists that we look outside of ourselves. So the books that they have coming out in 2022 are, as I said, the continuation of Pet, so a young adult novel. They have a romance novel, their debut romance, and a collection of poetry. And why I wanted to highlight Akwaeke Emezi and why I feel you should read their books is because the writing is beautiful and astounding, and unlike other writing that I have encountered, I can't describe how it just gets in your brain, and it really is beguiling. But also their work is a strong representation of intersections that exist outside of the cultural norm. In their books, they're being seen, but some of their readers might also feel seen. And their books are a strong reminder of the fact that truth exists in multiple forms. So that is my spotlight on author Akwaeke Emezi. I hope that you pick up some of the books that they have already written or try some of the new things that they have coming out in 2022. Thanks for joining me.